Imagine a child learning that the world is unsafe, not through words, but through the very wiring of their developing brain. This isn't a story of weakness, it's a survival mechanism with a lifelong cost. For decades, psychology believed children were resilient, bouncing back from adversity with enough love. But neuroscience reveals a harsher truth. Chronic stress in childhood doesn't just upset a child emotionally, it physically alters the brain's structure. This is not about weakness, it's about survival. The brain develops from bottom up and back to front. The brainstem, controlling basic life functions, develops first. Above it sits the limbic system, the emotional center, including the amygdala, the fear detector, and the hippocampus, responsible for memory. Finally, the prefrontal cortex, governing impulse control and emotional regulation, develops last. In a safe environment, the prefrontal cortex learns to calm the amygdala's alarms. But in a chronically traumatic environment, the brain's stress response system becomes permanently sensitized, reshaping neural pathways for a lifetime. The hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis is the body's central stress response system. When a threat is detected, a cascade of hormones releases cortisol, the primary stress hormone. In a healthy system, cortisol rises with a threat and falls once it passes. But in children exposed to chronic trauma, this system becomes dysregulated. Research shows that adults abused as children often have heightened cortisol responses to stress. Yet in some cases, particularly with prolonged trauma, the system can become blunted, producing too little cortisol, as if burned out. This paradox, too much or too little, reflects the brain's desperate attempt to adapt to an abnormal environment. The result is a stress response that no longer serves its protective purpose, leaving the child either hyper-aroused or emotionally numb. Perhaps the most well-documented change in trauma-exposed children is the alteration of the amygdala, the brain's threat detection center. In a safe environment, the amygdala learns to calibrate its sensitivity. A sudden movement is not a punch, a raised voice is not a scream. But in a traumatic environment, the amygdala becomes hyperreactive. Brain scans show that children who have experienced maltreatment exhibit heightened amygdala activation in response to emotional faces, even neutral or happy ones. This means the brain is constantly scanning for danger, even when none exists. The child isn't choosing to be anxious. The amygdala has been biologically programmed to see threat everywhere. Structural changes also occur, with some studies finding enlarged or smaller amygdala volumes, depending on the timing and type of trauma. The hippocampus is critical for forming and retrieving memories, especially contextual ones, the where and when of an experience. It helps distinguish past from present threats. In trauma-exposed children, the hippocampus is often smaller and less functional. Elevated cortisol levels, sustained over time, can damage hippocampal neurons and inhibit the birth of new neurons. The consequences are profound. Trauma-related memories may be poorly contextualized. A child may not remember the specific details of abuse, only the overwhelming terror. This fragmentation of memory is a hallmark of trauma, leading to triggering where a present-day cue, a smell, a sound, activates the full emotional response of the past. Without the brain recognizing the threat is gone. The prefrontal cortex is the brain's CEO, responsible for executive functions like planning, impulse control, and emotional regulation. It matures last, not reaching full development until the mid-20s, making it especially vulnerable to early trauma. Chronic stress impairs its functioning. Brain scans show reduced activity in the prefrontal cortex of trauma-exposed children. This means the brain's brake on the amygdala's fear response is weakened. Without a fully functioning prefrontal cortex, a child struggles to calm down after a perceived threat. They may act impulsively or have difficulty regulating emotions. This isn't a choice, it's a biological adaptation to a chaotic environment. The very region needed to override fear is compromised, leaving the child trapped in a state of heightened alert. The brain's adaptations to trauma come at a cost. A hyperactive amygdala, a shrunken hippocampus, and a weakened prefrontal cortex create a neural profile that persists into adulthood. This rewiring increases the risk for anxiety disorders, depression, and PTSD. It also affects physical health, with higher rates of cardiovascular disease and autoimmune disorders. But there is hope. The brain retains some plasticity. With proper support, therapy, and safe environments, neural pathways can be reshaped. Understanding this rewiring is not about labeling individuals as damaged. It's about recognizing the profound impact of early experiences and the potential for healing. The brain's architecture is not destiny. It can be rebuilt. The brain's architecture is not destiny. Understanding how trauma rewires it is the first step toward healing. If you found this valuable, consider exploring more about neuroplasticity.